Greetings from Stanford University. I'm Bill Barnett.
I'm Ingrid Ackermann.
And we have with us here today Professor Wes Hartmann from Stanford Graduate School of Business, Professor Yewon Kim from the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and Professor Bryan Bollinger, who we're fortunately having visiting here at Stanford, but who's normally at NYU. Thanks so much for coming, all three of you. And Ingrid, you were at the conference we had just this weekend on marketing for environmental sustainability. What was your reaction?
I thought this conference was incredible. Going into it, I had little experience with marketing. I hadn't read very much about it or spent a fair bit of time on it, but I came out of the conference very curious and more open-minded, so it was fantastic.
Oh, that's great to hear. Well, we've got all three of the co-chairs here. What questions do you have for them, Ingrid?
Lots of questions. To start, I guess if each of you could think about the most surprising or useful thing that you found from the conference. So I guess we can start with you, Wes.
So the conference, we put it together, and I think when we started it, we weren't sure kind of what the academic audience was going to be or how many people were working in this area. It's a pretty new area to the field. So I think one of the biggest surprises was just the people that I met who applied to come to present the papers, and then the diversity of the talks that we saw, covering topics ranging from, water conservation as an area I had worked. We had talks on kind of hardcore electricity, things about labeling of different packages, et cetera. So I think a wide variety of things, but yet I'd say it's like a pretty small community looking at it. So I think, I think the most surprising thing to me was like there's a lot of opportunity here in this area to try to grow it in our field and understand how marketing can contribute to environmental sustainability.
That's wonderful. I think the cross-pollination is really fantastic as well, to get ideas from academia, like outside of academia, and help different departments think about how they can incorporate other things into their work. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with Wes. I was also pleasantly surprised by just like the sheer amount of excitement that people showed. And then we had some audiences from other fields, like not just marketing, but economics, accounting, and then they were all like very engaged in the middle of the talk, raising all these questions. And then they also brought some different perspectives that marketing people could leverage potentially. So that was like one of the pleasant surprise elements. The other thing was we all sort of agreed where we could improve. So one of the things that we constantly came up with as a group was most of the data sets that we were working on had this like large measurement errors and noise. So that part itself is not necessarily contained to the marketing field. Like we as like a group, a broader academic community, we can definitely put some more efforts, group efforts, to make some advances in collecting better data sets to understand how to improve like sustainability on all social aspects. So yeah, that was like one thing that I learned.
I completely agree with Wes and Yewon. And first of all, I'd like to say I'm thrilled to be back at the Stanford GSB. I did my doctoral work here a little over a decade, and it's always a wonderful environment to come to. One of the things that attracted me to this area was the fact that it was so interdisciplinary. I teach a class right now on marketing and sustainability, and I get to talk with people working in finance, people working in strategy, people working in accounting, and everyone is really excited by this burgeoning area of work, and we feel like many fields have a lot to contribute here. And the measurement issue that Yewon brought up is not just from the academic side, our difficulty in measuring phenomenon that maybe businesses have better handles on, but it's a challenge for the entire industry, the accounting of ESG metrics, consumers' ability to understand what is the actual carbon footprint of the tomato that they are consuming, to reference The Good Place for any of you who watch that show. So the measurement issue is a real challenge, and it affects how consumers respond to any of these sustainable marketing initiatives that firms are trying to implement.
I have to say, as a outsider to the marketing area, I was blown away, I think as you were, Ingrid, by the breadth of coverage of marketing that touches on sustainability. I was in the Rocky Mountains a few weeks ago, meeting with some experts in various aspects of sustainability, and one of them actually was quite radical in his perspective. And I asked him at some point, what are you up to? He's a practitioner, and he said, well, I'm getting a degree in marketing. And I couldn't, marketing? He said, yeah, if we're actually going to do this, we have to understand what the experts in marketing understand. And I'll throw my question into the mix. If there's one takeaway that just blew your mind that you didn't expect, I mean, you obviously invited some papers, you read all these papers, you knew the papers that didn't make it into the conference. If there's one finding that just blew your mind, what would that be? What did we learn?
I wouldn't say it was sort of a new idea for me, but it just reinforced the challenge in the measurement for me. I think that marketing has a lot to offer in this space because as marketers, we think about value creation for the end customer. And this could be a business-to-business context, it could be business-to-consumer context, but where is it that value is actually being created? And sustainability is one area in that value creation. But across the papers we saw at the conference, the first paper was talking about just the simple difficulty of consumers understanding information related to the sustainability credentials of firms. We had a couple other papers talking about the impacts of nudges and how they might interact with optimal tax policy. We had another paper looking at the unintended consequences of a green nudge, where you might have some other behavior respond in a way unanticipated by policymakers. And it's trying to deal with these challenges.
Bryan, what do you mean by nudge? Let me just sort of...
Yes, so nudges are used a lot, and the economics literature has studied nudges. The marketing literature, including our behavioral colleagues, have studied nudges. And the idea of a nudge is just it's a simple intervention other than something like a tax or sort of a price intervention, which might change how consumers respond in the marketplace. Something like a carbon label on a product would fall into that category of nudges.
I see.
And the impact of that nudge depends on a lot of different factors, everything from how reliable the information is, how trustworthy the news source is, whether it can be verified, whether consumers understand the nature of that information as well. And because there's so many different factors that can influence the effectiveness of that nudge, it can be really hard to understand what the implication is going to be when you implement a nudge. And one of the papers we talked about showed how if consumers respond in different ways, so Yewon responds to a nudge and I don't, that has huge implications when things like prices are set as part of a market equilibrium.
I see.
So going off of that, the word that I heard the most throughout the conference was heterogeneity. Can one of you please explain how that word fits into this narrative and why it's so important in marketing relating to sustainability?
Maybe I'll start. Just marketing as a field, heterogeneity is very important. And the idea is recognizing that different people, different consumers have different tastes. They respond to things in different ways. And that's, I think, one of the unique things about marketing is that once you start to think about that, the solutions that you need are going to be tailored separately to each of those different types of people. And so I think that's an important part that came up through many of the different talks. It came up in the talk that my co-author presented about trying to get people to conserve water, is realizing that, we could think of a lot of policies that might be able to conserve a ton of water, but really we want the policy that appeals to those people who use a bunch of water. And so we need to think about that heterogeneous different person and what is the solution that applies best to them. And so that's kind of just one way to think about heterogeneity. It's just differences across people. And I think to tie it back into the paper that Bryan was just talking about on the nudges, it made a very good point that if people are heterogeneous, or if the nudge affects people in different ways, it can actually start to put distortions into the market that didn't already exist before. So just if you kind of, I think the way they describe it's almost an allocative efficiency standpoint, as we would call it, is that they gave an example of, say you have a resource and you have a fixed supply of it, and you distribute it across society and different people are consuming it. And if it's a fixed supply, it's all going to get consumed. And then you kind of put this nudge in, and some people respond one way and other people respond another way. You actually shift who starts to consume at that point, but you don't shift the aggregate amount of the resource. And from a sustainability standpoint, we often care about reducing the amount of that resource. And in many cases, nudges will reduce that resource, or will reduce the amount of water we consume or the electricity we consume. But it's going to switch around who's consuming it, and it might do that in a fairly inefficient way if some people aren't understanding or responding to that nudge the way they should. So I thought that was I agree. I thought that was also a pretty kind of surprising finding that I was glad everybody at the conference had a chance to see, and hopefully people can think about.
Speaking with an industry professional who was launching an electric vehicle, and he said one of the challenges with electric vehicles is that the people, and this was pre-Tesla, the people buying electric vehicles are the people who fundamentally think we shouldn't be driving. So if you think about the carbon influence of someone who is trying to walk to the grocery store and their driving is held in check, there's a lot lower benefit from an environmental standpoint in having them have an electric vehicle versus the person who's actually driving a lot. And one of the great things about the paper that Christina presented that Wes is a co-author on is that it was showing how automated technologies actually gets the people consuming lots of water to reduce their consumption, because those who already care about reducing water consumption have already responded to do so to sort of the best of their ability. And it's these other consumers that we need to target using other policy tools or technologies.
That's interesting. It strikes me that one form of heterogeneity that might come in here would be heterogeneity in terms of some people being well off and some people being impoverished. How do the bottom billion factor into the thinking going on in marketing and sustainability?
So I would say most of the research that we saw through the conference was more focused on, say, U.S. consumers as opposed to kind of globally. And I think I think that's a challenge for the academic community broadly in the U.S. is to kind of reach out globally, and especially for the academic community and business schools. Like there's certain specialized fields like development economics that kind of speak to the global area. But actually there was a good paper that Bryan was a co-author on that I think made a nice distinction about how different groups of customers respond to solar initiatives and how the distributive effects are coming up there. And if you want to share some of those insights.
I mean, I think it really depends on what the main barriers are for adoption by lower wealth households. In this example of solar panels, one of the criticisms of some solar policies has been that people who are more likely to adopt solar panels are wealthier consumers, especially in places like California, where you have tiered electricity prices, because when you install solar panels, you are offsetting the marginal price of electricity with that first panel that you install. So if you have higher wealth, higher consumption consumers, they are getting more economic benefit from offsetting that electricity consumption that they would get from the grid. And this can be exacerbated by the fact that if high consumers discount that future stream of benefits less than lower wealth consumers who might be more credit constrained, that also has implications for the degree to which a lower wealth consumer would value the stream of benefits they get over the, say, 25-year lifespan of solar panels. And there's things that could be done from a policy perspective where you change the type of incentives. So if you were to reduce the net energy metering benefit for solar panels and that was compensated through an upfront subsidy, that would change the distributional allocation of who would actually want to install solar panels if there actually is a gap in the discount rates. And one of the things that that paper found was that the lower wealth consumers who were installing solar were discounting the future at about 20% per year rather than 10%. So that kind of a gap can really lead to a difference in the valuation of this durable, sustainable product.
Sure. That's interesting. And for the listeners who aren't familiar with this idea of a discount rate, if you think about much of what we do in sustainability, it's about what we value today versus what we value to preserve for those who will enjoy that tomorrow. And I guess to sum it up, if you're hungry, your discount rate is different than if you're not, right? And so for the bottom billion.
Sure. I actually want to introduce another sort of element of heterogeneity that plays a significant role, which is heterogeneity in information stock that consumers have. So Eric Johnson from Columbia, he gave a talk about how consumers just although they're all well-intentioned, they really want to be green, but they just simply don't know which action is more impactful and then which one is more sustainable. Just like that sheer information frictions and then heterogeneity information friction across different people can play a role and then can bring some unintended consequences from different policies. And then that information stock also varies, not just across consumers, but also across different firms. So Bryan also presented a nice paper on how these different markets seem to face different sustainable profit potentials. And perhaps, like we were actually discussing after the talk, perhaps the mechanism behind that is due to this information frictions that firms are facing. Maybe these firms and these brands just like don't really understand which market might actually have, more profitability when they introduce more sustainable products. So maybe Bryan, you can also add something more to that. I don't know.
It's a really tough question. One of the places you do see a lot of work in marketing is on labels, and this is everything from calorie and other nutritional labels to now some sustainability labels. And one of the things we found in the health literature is that if you want to try to figure out what the effect is going to be of something like calorie labeling, prior beliefs matter. We wouldn't expect health labels to have a huge impact if the information provided is not new. There could be an effect of seeing it right there in your face. I remember when California first implemented calorie labels, and I would go get my milkshake when I lived in Berkeley, and I'd say, oh my God, this thing has 1,700 calories. But I kind of already knew that, so it was there in my face, but I still got the milkshake. But if it's new information, I can actually incorporate that within my decision-making process. So some of these sustainability labels are providing new information, and that's when we might think there could be scope for consumers to alter their behavior. But if that information is readily available through other sources as well, and it's not too costly to acquire that, then the consumers who care the most might have already searched for that information. So we don't really expect sort of a continuous linear response here. It depends on how much you care about the information, what your prior beliefs were, again, how much you can verify and believe that information. Anita Rao, who is a former PhD graduate of the Stanford School of Business, has some really interesting work on false claims by consumer packaged goods and the degree to which consumers might respond to those. So the quality of this informational content also matters quite a bit.
I just want to highlight why this heterogeneity in preference for taste versus heterogeneity in information is really important, because they actually give very different implications in terms of policymaking. So if, let's say that I don't buy sustainable products and Bryan does, and then let's say that's just purely because we have different taste or preferences for sustainable goods, then giving me, who's not buying any sustainable products, any information about sustainability won't change my behavior. But if my non-purchase of non-sustainable products is due to my lack of information about which product is sustainable, then the government or any entity has more incentives to provide that relevant information to consumers, and then they will make some impact. So it actually applies to not just these consumers' choices, but also adopting solar panels. Like, is that because of information friction, or is that because of some other heterogeneity in discount rates, something like that, that explains people's different choices. I think so. That is why understanding what drives this heterogeneity, observed heterogeneity in people's action is really important.
And Yewon pointed to access, and that is clearly an issue as well. That paper that she referred to that I presented, looking at the penetration and the demand of sustainable products. There are places where you see sort of the penetration of sustainable products, given the profit potential that they would have, does under-index in some types of areas. So you see sort of more entry of sustainable products in higher wealth areas than lower wealth areas, for example, which cannot be explained just from the profitability of those areas. So access is clearly a key, which also goes back to your question about sort of maybe lower wealth consumers, if they don't even have access to be able to buy these products.
Sure.
And if I can jump in on that point, it was fascinating to see this in the data itself. For example, a sustainable brand, their goal is always to sell as much product as possible. Up in the Northeast, where there's high demand for sustainable products, they're charging more than, say, the average product. But in, say, Texas, where there's less of a demand for sustainable products, they're actually charging less than the average in order to drive up their revenue. So I found that just fascinating.
Oh, that's interesting. So much of the discussion here has been about information. And Bryan, just in passing, you mentioned the problem of false claims. And folks talk about greenwashing all the time. And just from a naive perspective, a lot of our listeners are like me, where I often wonder, do we fall for it? I mean, could it be cheap talk? How do we know that this information's real? What does marketing tell us?
A lot of it can be cheap talk, and my students are always asking me about greenwashing, and there's lots of examples if you watch like the late night shows about some of these claims which are just crazy. And one of the challenges is how verifiable information is when consumers see it. And that's why it's so hard for the end consumer to actually know what the footprint is of the product that they're buying, because it's hard to verify where that product actually came from. And some firms are trying to use new technologies to help verify that. Blockchain is starting to be used in the fashion industry to track both inputs and outputs. So if a fashion product gets sold a second time, I can actually see how it moves through the marketplace by having it verified through the blockchain. So the ability of technology to try to help reduce the costs of collecting verifiable information is a pretty exciting area.
Well, that's really interesting.
Actually, I'd say on that topic, both Yewon and Bryan talked about papers that had third parties who were trying to help validate some of those claims, right? So instead of just the company saying, hey, my product is sustainable, there are other groups out there that try to validate this. I don't know if you want to share your...
Yeah, so to me, greenwashing can happen if three of these descriptive facts hold. One, firms are potentially engaging, just like so-called greenwashing behavior, saying they're just engaging cheap talk. That's one thing. And the second, consumers do prefer sustainable products. Like if they don't, I mean, whatever cheap talk firms are making, it wouldn't have any impact. And finally, consumers don't have information in terms of whether or not each claim is credible. So if consumers respond differently to different types of claims based on different sources, let's say, if consumers respond more to these third-party verified claims versus first-party own brand generated claims, then actually that will mitigate some potential impact of greenwashing because consumers are aware of which information that this claim is based on. So Christina Brecko at Rochester, who's also a former graduate of Stanford Graduate School of Business, she and I are looking into this exact matter. So we are now in the process of manually coding all these claims that exist on product labels, whether or not they are certified by any third-party certifiers versus not, and then whether consumers seem to respond differently to those claims. So we're now in the process of augmenting the data set, which is really exciting, and then hope to get a better answer to that.
And there is then work in marketing trying to tie these impacts to firm value. So the second paper on the program that we had this weekend by Vivek Esvanch at Indiana was presenting some work that he has started on that, trying to tie the environmental footprint of a firm to its brand equity.
That's interesting, and then back to the paper you're working on, Yewon. Maybe next year at the Marketing and Sustainability Conference, we'll hear about the results of
absolutely.
that study. So we're going to wrap it up here. Thank you, all three of you, for coming, and thank you, listeners, on behalf of the Stanford Graduate School of Business and the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability. We'll see you at Stanford. The Stanford Initiative on Business and Environmental Sustainability podcast series is sponsored by the Stanford Graduate School of Business and the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability. Music by Charged Particles. That's Caleb Hutzler, Mike Rock, and John Krosnick.